Question.
The question would be, what was your goal when you first initiated the History Makers program?
I was very intrigued about the telling of stories. I was also troubled about images that I saw of African Americans. That the images were mainly negative, that they did not cover the breadth of the African American experience, and I often found myself amazed by talking to people with things that they had done and experienced many years ago. And so I would say that my first motivation was when I was in college. And I was American Studies and Theater Arts major. And I was doing a research program on the Harlem Renaissance and was interviewing people like Butterfly McQueen, Lee Whipple, who was the oldest living black actor at the time. And the thing that struck me is I found these people living under impoverished conditions. Butterfly McQueen at her height was making $3,000 a week when she started in Gone with the Wind. The thing that struck me, I recorded their stories at that time, and I spent a lot of time at the Schomburg Library and was amazed. It was almost being taken back into history and sort of seeing and learning. In fact, I first learned about Etta Moulton Barnett, that she had been the played Bess in Porgy and Bess, so I was really very excited when I moved to Chicago to learn that she lived here, me being my background in theater. The other thing is that about 7 years ago, I have a small production company, and Tanqueray had hired us to bring their Black History calendar to life. And what I found amazing about that experience, though it never came to fruition, I went running around Chicago interviewing people, and I was struck by the stories that were told, and that was probably the seed. I also, when I did Etta Moulton Barnett's interview, I said, Mrs. Barnett, I really would like to have some footage of you, and she referred me over to a gentleman named Fred McDonald, and I went over there thinking he was black. He wasn't. And I remember sitting in my car afterwards thinking, I bet he wouldn't even sell that collection to me. He had a very sort of interesting collection. And I said he probably picked it up for a song and a prayer, but it was and he wouldn't sell it to me. And that struck me that our own history did not exist in our own hands. And then about 3 years ago, I went to the National Bar Association convention, and it was a very controversial convention because Clarence Thomas was speaking, and Leon Higginbotham, Judge Higginbotham, who I very much admired, was there. And there was a panel, a civil rights panel, and people on the panel were people like Reverend Billy Kyles and Constance Baker Motley, Judge Motley. And it really struck me at that time that these were people we know about, the Rosa Parks, but these were people who were as involved in the civil rights movement that no one knew about, yet they were as instrumental as the people that we heard about. And that's really where the inspiration came from. If
I could have you say that response again, you said that the people that the History Makers program focuses on are just as important as the popular figures in Black history. Mm. And so if I could just have you restate that again.
Okay. The History Makers focuses on the unsung as well as the well-known African American history makers. Too often in our community, when you hear people talked about, whether in common parlance or during Black History Month, which is the shortest month of the year, mind you, to celebrate Black history, you hear the names mentioned of Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, Michael Jordan, Reverend Jesse Jackson, as if that is the sole the entire being of our community. And really what we're trying to show with the history makers is that our history makers number not in the, in the tens, or not even in the hundreds, they number in the thousands. And the fact of the matter is that the last time that there has been a massive recordation, a true intent to record on a massive basis the story of the African American experience has occurred during the WPA movement with the recording of ex-slaves. It was under the Roosevelt administration, and people like Zora Neale Hurston, a well-known African-American novelist, were sent out with other people around the South to interview former slaves. But that's our last time at recordation, and I often say, is that what we're going to represent? Is that going to be our legacy? This is a legacy of people who had no choice, who were brought here against their will. And what do we see represented in 20th century history? We don't have a lot of that record in existence.
Hold on a second. The importance of archiving and recordation once more.
If a people, any person, doesn't know their own history or their own background, it's very hard for them to get a sense about where they want to go or their place in society. And I remember being a young person sitting in class in elementary school, and who did I learn about? I learned about George Washington Carver, W.E.B. Du Bois, and slavery. That was about it. And I remember that when they would talk about slavery, I'd want to sort of go slinking into my seat, feeling embarrassed, because while it seemed something that was not something you would be proud of. And this goes back to imaging, a self-image. It's very important for people to have, positive self-esteem. And how do you have positive self-esteem if you don't know your place in history? And so we have a place. African Americans have a place. What the history makers can show so well is that, one, our history makers number in the thousands. Two, we have a rich experience out here that falls way outside the categories of sports and entertainment, the areas that people commonly think of us in. Three, we just lost my train of thought. I just lost my train of thought.
The history makers up until this point.
Right.
Hold on, I gotta change batteries. We're rolling. Just talk about your experiences so far with the history makers that you've interviewed.
It has been my pleasure the last year, and I must say pleasure, to have sat for an average of 2 hours with different history makers. And it has been a very enriching, rewarding experience for me, and probably the thing I most enjoy about this project, and I wish other people could experience. In a matter of 2 hours, you learn a lot about people, and the people that I've interviewed. We've interviewed a lot of people in Chicago. We started with our Chicago launch. Whether I can think of the afternoon that I spent with Etta Moulton Barnett. It was a beautiful afternoon. She's, as you know, soon to be 99 years old, it was a magical time with she and her daughter, Suish. We learned about her growing up in Texas, her time on the farm, her sort of meteoric rise on Broadway at a time when people didn't have that experience. And so I often come away feeling like I've been the one rewarded, and not vice versa. And I wish everyone could experience this because it's enriching and it's very important. And that's what we're really trying to do with the History Makers, is not only preserve the story, but to massively tell the story. And the thing that we have the ability to do now, and the merging of new technologies, and that's what it's about. A lot of people ask me, what is it? They want to put it in some self-contained thing that they understand already. The History Makers is an archival project. It is not a documentary, one documentary. It's not a TV program. It's not a radio series. It is an archival project. And in many ways, and the reason that I have shortcutted the description, it resembles Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. After his making of Schindler's List, Spielberg went out and said that we want to record the Holocaust experience. And over the last 5 years, they have recorded 50,000 interviews in a 5-year period. At their height, they were recording 300 interviews a week, and still today are recording 16 interviews a week. What that means, that history will never, ever, ever go away. And we have the same urgency, if not more urgency, in the African American community. Because this represents our 20th century history, and our history makers, many of them have died and are dying. And so the thing about this is not that oral histories are new. Oral histories have been around, for a while. They definitely gained predominance in the 1970s, mainly the tool of academia. And we have oral histories that exist, mainly in the area of civil rights and the area of slavery, not to say that's the sum and total of the oral history experience. But with the History Makers, we're looking at a very methodic approach to record, and we've identified 14 categories. It may be civic makers, music makers, entertainment makers, education makers, science makers. But we want to show the breadth and depth of the African American experiences told through the first person, someone telling their own stories. And we call these stories stories of inspiration, success, achievement. And in many ways, we feel that if these stories can get out, it will show that African Americans, in many ways, are the rags to riches story in the United States. We often have taken...
I'm going to have you restart that statement again. I'm going to have you put your hands down, because if hands come up, they're a little bit too bright and we get some streaking.
Okay.
So I'm just going to have you start with African Americans are the rags to riches story of America.
And in many ways, African Americans are the rags to riches stories in America. We've often taken a piece of coal and made a diamond out of it, over and over and over again. And that's what I consider enriching. And I wish everyone in the audience who is seeing this tape will come by and visit us at 1900 South Michigan and sit for a couple hours and look and experience people who you think you know, but you really don't, or have judgment about, and really find that their story is so much different than you think and what is reported in the newspapers. We start at their early years, what they know about their parents, their grandparents, and we work up into the present. You were asking, let me go back to say that oral histories oral histories have existed for some number of years. The thing that makes it exciting right now, and that the History Makers is aggressively pursuing as we're merging the traditional academic oral history with new technologies. And the internet allows us to bring these stories to the mass public without any intervention from anyone. So if you go to our website, which is www.thehistorymakers.com, you will be able to sample our archives, see what people say, what they think, what they thought about certain things, what their background is. We have timetables, we have glossary sections. It's a wonderful, wonderful educational tool. And what we have found is people have been very, very receptive to the concept. What was probably most affirming was that the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian have indicated an interest in working with us. But it's that merging, the merging of the old and the new, that allows this information to get out. So we are looking for 4 different types of partnerships: academic and community. Those are where we intend to have our resources come from. People who can tell us where different history makers exist, because it's not always that easy to find people. And then media is a very important area, because we need to get it out. And we were blessed for this past year that we had CBS radio here, WBBM, News Radio 780 AM, that saw the potential in this and was willing to make the commitment to take it out of Black History Month. We start in February of this year. And Georgianne Herbert, I have to give her a lot of credit there. Every Tuesday from the beginning of February until now, a different history maker has been featured. And that's novel, because still in this day, our history is still relegated to Black History Month, and that's a shame. And one thing you will find about the history makers, just like this program is occurring, our national launch this evening, our whole approach is to show that this is American history, and this history is something to be celebrated every day, not just in the shortest day of the month.
Shortest month of the year.
No, shortest. Oh, that's right. Okay. Tired. Okay. So that's what, anyway, that's what this,
Let's start out by saying the History Makers celebrates Black history, not only.
Okay. The History Makers celebrates African American history not only during Black History Month, but every day of the year.
Okay. And what was I thinking? Oh, there was a question that I wanted to find out. The History Makers, how do you hope that it catches on from this point, from the national launch? Tell me, talk about the hoping for branch offices getting more people involved.
Right. We've learned a lot the last year. There were 2 questions that were posed to me by people, some naysayers saying, you know, whoever would be interested in this? And we've learned that one thing, that an archive like this doesn't exist, and that if one was created, there would be interest in it. But the whole thing is that we need to build the archives. And so over the next year, starting with tonight, and we are very blessed that Harry Belafonte, through his support behind this project, and he elicited the support also of his friend, Danny Glover, and that allowed us to have this national launch tonight. And we are looking very forward after this period during the year 2001 and sending crews around the country and selected markets where we will set up for a week at a time, interviewing different African American history makers. But our goal and how we plan to do things, our goal is to do 5,000 interviews over a 5-year period. Often people ask me, how do you plan to do 5,000 interviews? We want to establish 5 different markets out of those markets, we want to have 200 interviews coming out of each market. Our model will be very similar to the model used by CNN or C-SPAN, where you have local crews that follow a formula and approach, and that will allow for recordation, and the end result will be the largest archive of its kind in the world. The result also will be the recording of this history that is so vitally important to American society and to the world society at large. And I'm hoping that everyone in the audience will see the value, the inherent value, not just for us who are sitting here today, but for kids and children, to erase the negative stereotypes that exist that are not based on anything, not based on anything factual, except that they are stereotypes. And that people will come to know the true contributions that African Americans have made to this to society, and in a whole variety of areas. And so our approach will be methodical. Our approach needs a lot of support, money. We've made tremendous progress on a little money and a lot of energy, but it's going to take, in an overused parlance right now, it's going to take a village to make this happen. But the end result is that everyone will benefit.
I want to get a nice soundbite about the History Makers isn't doing this just for the purpose of today, but also for the future benefit of generations. Not just relying on stereotypes and secondhand information about, lesser known individuals. Or let's say, how would you typify the History Makers as a project for the next generation of African Americans?
The generation that exists right now has really no knowledge of the Civil Rights Movement and even Martin Luther King. And so this project is vitally important for younger people coming along, both black and white or whatever hue. And so if we don't take an aggressive stand right now to record this, while people are still standing amongst us, then shame on us. And then when people go to tell, and for those people who are history makers, for those people who go to tell your story, then shame on you. If you have not taken the time to record for posterity's sake your history. And probably the best example of that is the Egyptians. When you look at that society, and that's one that you can speak about, but there was massive recordation of that society for us to go back and study.
Let's start with there was massive recordation of the Egyptian culture. How does that relate to the African American culture of today?
There has been massive recordation in lots of different societies, Egyptian, European, and so people are able to talk very proudly of their heritage. and where they come from, and it gives people a sense of place. And for African Americans who were separated from their homeland and placed in a very foreign country and their family split up, often we think we have no sense of place. And if you have no sense of place, then how can you move forward? So this is an attempt, the History Makers is an attempt to sort of correct before it's too late. While we have people among us, both well known and unsung. I give a good example. One day, we were going to interview Colonel Thompson. And when I went to the interview, on my way, because we always well-research things, I knew Colonel Thompson was a Tuskegee Airman. That's all I knew about him. When we got to Colonel Thompson's home, he had been preparing for us for 3 days, and he had boxes and boxes of photographs. And turns out he was the chief documenter for the 99th Squadron, the famous squadron for the Tuskegee Airmen, headed by Benjamin O. Davis. And he sits me down at a table and he says, "Have you ever heard of the Golden 13? And I said, "No, Colonel Thompson, I've never heard of the Golden 13. He said, "Well, they were the Navy's version of the Tuskegee Airmen, and there are 4 left in this country, and one lives upstairs, and he wants to talk to you." That's the magic of a project like this. The uncovering, the discovering, all of that will be a very healing experience, not for African Americans, but for Americans in general. It is our plan at the History Makers to build this extensive archive, initially of 5,000 interviews, but that won't be the start. It is our plan through the archives to provide a facility that people will be able to come to and actually look at the interviews unfettered in full form. Also that we will have the internet site to sample the archives for everyone to experience. And to develop partnerships that will help us get information out into the to the broader community. And to eventually at least create a body of material that can be used for educational purposes, for libraries, museums, that type of thing. And the real dream is to create a digital archive, much the same way that the Shoah Foundation is doing, but to create a digital archive where this archive could be made available to historically black colleges and universities and African American museums, as well as using the internet too to make the archive available to major institutions. And if we are able to do that, we will be leaving a true legacy. And so I'm hoping that all of you in the audience who are here this evening will work with us, will join our bandwagon, will participate with us in creating a true African American legacy for generations to come. We need your support, we need your money, we need your volunteerism. We need a lot to make this happen.